Thank you for joining us this week on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And each week we invite you to send in your questions, your curiosities, things that you've wondered about, old houses you've seen and been curious about. Send in your questions to us and we'll have fun exploring the history of the city of Mississauga together. Thank you, Aubrey, for your question on the bird sanctuary on Erindale, just up Mississauga Road across from the main entrance to the University of Toronto Mississauga campus. Just to give you a background to it, you're interested in the story of the bird sanctuary. It was known as Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary. And it was established in the early 1930s, possibly as early as 1929. The beginning date is a little bit unknown, but certainly by 1930-31 it was operating, and it was under the direction of Hans Roy Ivor. Roy lived between 1880 and 1879, and he is the one who established the Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary along Mississauga Road. The sanctuary, its name, first of all, simply came from the long winding laneway that accessed the property. Roy Ivor, as he was known, was affectionately known as the Birdman of Erindale, and he was a well-known but amateur ornithologist and naturalist. Roy published numerous articles in the Auk, National Geographic, Wilson Bulletin, and even published a book called I Live with Birds. He received an honorary doctorate of sciences from the University of Windsor in 1972, and he was a recipient of the Order of Canada in 1974. Roy Ivor was born in Strathroy, Ontario on January 3rd of 1880, but he grew up in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and then later in the Toronto area. Roy along with his mother, Roy never married, but along with his mother moved to Erindale in 1928. And he was a lifelong bachelor. He remained in their home at the Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary until after his mother's death, and she died in 1959 at the age of 105. For many who knew Roy and visited his Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary, and there are many people who did, myself included, as a very young boy, I had an opportunity to meet Roy Ivor, later meeting Bernice Inman, who took over the operation of the sanctuary after Roy's passing. Roy was seen as a kind of a gentle, kind man with a sense of humor who dedicated himself to studying and caring for sick and injured birds. Roy wrote about the emotions and personalities of birds that people brought to him, and people came from all over Canada and even the United States to visit the famed Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary. Roy cared for birds for over 50 years on the property. He took in numerous volunteers and took care of thousands of birds over his time. He even Roy welcomed school children to the property, and something that was continued by Bernice Inman in the years after. Really kind of taught an early respect, if you will, for birds and for wildlife and for caring for nature. Roy's original home was lost to fire on December 2nd of 1970, December 2nd of 1970. And following the fire, there was an amazing outpouring of support from the community to establish an emergency fund to care for Roy, who was aging at that point. Donations came in from across Canada and even abroad. A residential trailer was procured out of this fund, and Roy spent much of the remaining years of his life living in the trailer adjacent to where his home once stood. Ivor passed away on December 10th of 1979 at the age of 99, and he's buried nearby at the Erindale Cosmopolitan Cemetery, and his grave, appropriately enough, is marked with a small birdhouse. Following Roy's passing, Bernice Inman Emery, who had volunteered with Roy since 1962, she acquired 3 acres of the property and then continued the work of the sanctuary, Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary, or Winding Lane Sanctuary as it came to be known later. With the help of other volunteers, Bernice continued to care for injured animals, not only birds, but animals of all their kinds, and the surrounding woodland environment became very much an environmental advocate in the city of Mississauga. The city of Mississauga acquired the former Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary property in 2010. And in keeping with the spirit of the property and that of Roy and later of Bernice, the property is maintained as a quiet, natural space. A number of institutions maintain collections associated with Roy Ivor, including the museums of Mississauga. And as I said, Roy is buried nearby at the Erindale Cosmopolitan Cemetery. So really a well-known and respected individual within our early community. People came from far and wide to bring sick and injured birds to the bird sanctuary, and even to this day, you'll find the name Ivor right across our landscape. There are residential buildings at the UTM. There's a nearby housing subdivision. There's park, and you'll see today on the property there's a plaque that welcomes you to the area of what was formerly Winding Lane Bird Sanctuary, still well remembered on our landscape. So thank you for the question, Aubrey. Look forward to chatting more with you about local history. Thank you, Catherine, for your question on the Dale Farmhouse, and a little humble vernacular historic farmhouse in Mississauga that has long attached my fascination. Some things that survive are kind of seem out of place on our modern landscape in a way. And here's a small, humble little farmhouse on the northwest corner of Dixie and Dairy Road that has maybe defied the odds and still remains on our landscape today. And it's caught my fascination over time, and not the least of which is actually its architecture. If you do a kind of a drive-by look, it's a very simple Georgian-esque style building. We believe it was built about 1856. It first appears on an 1861 census, and it belonged to the Dale family, so we refer to it as the Dale Farmhouse. The Dales owned it for the Dale family, and their extended family owned it for 110 years, or the property, I guess, for 110 years. The house a little bit, just over 100 years. But the house, although Georgian-esque in style, has an off-centered door, and it begs a question as to why the door isn't centered, because the tradition of architecture at the time, the front door would always be centered, and of course a roadside view doesn't offer the answer to that. So it's one of those curiosities. Also, at one point would have had a covered veranda on the property. There's a ghost of that image today on the structure if you look carefully, but the veranda is no longer. So historically, this house would have looked a little different than it does to this day. There also was at one point a rear wing to the house, which was replaced over time, and so part of the original fabric of the house is not there any longer, although the old house still remains. And fascinating that it does so, and kind of what it tells us about the community that it once was part of. So the house again was known, or we refer to it as the Dale House, the farmhouse of John and Elizabeth Dale, built around 1856. Give you a brief timeline of the ownership history of the house. The patent was issued by the Crown to King's College in 1828, and the property was likely rented out and predated the house at this point. And it was finally, the property was sold to James Aikens in 1846, and it consisted then of 100 acres in size. A year later, in 1847, Aikens sold 70 acres of the property to John Dale. And so throughout the Dale ownership period, we're dealing with a 70-acre farm parcel. And John Dale, born about 1800 in England and came to Canada in the 1840s, settles here with his wife and his adopted daughter. We refer to his wife was named Elizabeth, so we refer to her as Elizabeth the Elder, and the daughter Elizabeth the Younger, and she was again the adopted daughter. The Dales do not appear to have children of their own. The only child that we can find listed is that of their adopted daughter Elizabeth, and what her parentage is, we're not entirely sure. John Dale himself lived until 1879, and in his property, in his will, the property was left to Elizabeth Dale. It is not clear in the will if he's referring to his wife or his widow, or his daughter. We're a little uncertain of that, although at the time of his passing, his daughter had recently married, and her surname at that point was Patterson. So it's very likely that he left the property to his wife, Elizabeth. The next entry we have on the ownership is a vestry order in 1913 between Robert Trimble and Ada Stewart, and it took a little bit of digging to figure out what the origin. Sometimes you see vestry orders and you think, oh, there's a squabble in the family. Doesn't appear to be in this case. It's actually just a clarification of the transfer of a will. What appears to have happened is that when Elizabeth the Elder passed away in 1883, there was no will, and the property continued to be lived in by her daughter and her family. The daughter herself passed away relatively young, leaving behind her husband, his name was Robert Trimble, and their daughter, Ada Trimble. And Ada goes on to marry and becomes Ada Stewart. So it looks like the vestry order in 1913 is simply between the father and behalf of John Dale's will, passing the property on to his daughter. The vestry order, however, put the authority of the property into the hands of William Joseph Patterson. And this is where families get kind of mixed up, because it appears that they all live together, but William Patterson was the husband of Elizabeth Dale the Younger, the adopted daughter. And so you have these kind of confusing elements of interrelated families. That the list of ownership doesn't really go into details, and so we can only guess at kind of how things get transferred from one generation to another. The property remained in the Dale Patterson family until 1957. That was 110 years, and approximately 100 years after the Dale house was built. In 1962, the property was acquired by Dorothy and Robert Bryan, and 10 years later, in 1972, by Vincent Marino. And then in 1974, the property was acquired by Mohinder Singh. And then later on this property, this is where the Ontario Khalsa Darbar, the Sikh Gurudwara, opened in 1988 with their official opening ceremonies in 1989. And the house remains used by the Sikh Gurudwara on the property today. So it's nice to see that it continues to have a function on the property. So the house itself, just to describe it again, a Georgian-style house, is a story and a half in height. So there would have been sleeping quarters in the half story above the main floor. Most Georgian houses at the time, in fact almost all, are symmetrical in design. That's a really kind of design element. And this house with the off-center front door begs a question. Of course, there is no immediate answer to why the door is off-center. It's an oddity. It's kind of one of those things that make you look at an old house and wonder why, wonder the decisions therein. And again, the house at once once had a veranda on front, so we don't know the detailing of it. We haven't been able to find any historic images of the house. We have obviously a lot of history on the property itself, but no images so far. Maybe that's something that will come to light and we'll be able to share down the road. As I mentioned earlier, the house was once part of a 70-acre farm. It included outbuildings and barns. There's a story, actually, the Dales would have had significant hardship in a very short period of time. On October 1st of 1869, as documented in the Brampton Conservator newspaper, the barn buildings burned to the ground. And to quote, "The entire products of the farm, wheat, barley, oats, and unthreshed, and then it's unreadable for a moment, were consumed in the fire." So they lost their buildings, but they also lost their crops of the year. And given how late it was in the year, October 1st of 1869, that is after the harvest. And so this would have been a significant hardship, not only financially from the rebuilding, but also just from a harvested crop material that late in the year. 1869 into 1870 would have been very difficult years for the Dale family. And they rebuild early in the spring of 1870. There's a new barn on property, and then sadly on June 24th, 1870, this family is just starting to recover from the fire the previous fall, and again the barn is consumed by fire. And again, this would have presented hardship beyond belief to the Dale family. We can only guess that the community rallied around them. We haven't actually found evidence of that. Maybe that's a future research project as well. But the Dales continued on the property, so they obviously recovered from this moment in time. But it would have been a significant hardship for this family, and I can only wonder what the experience might have been for them. The Dales were known to have farmed wheat, peas, oats, rye, and barley, along with a number of swine, a small number of swine or pigs that they kept on the property as well. They also had a market garden and 2 acres of cherry trees, and I think that's kind of a wonderful thought when we look at the property today. The actual small orchard, the 2-acre orchard, was located south of the house, kind of in between the house. It's set back a little bit on the property, and Dairy Road. And so if you can picture maybe the approach to this house, I might be a little romantic on thinking about it, but the approach to the house up the long laneway might have bisected this cherry orchard, and may have offered a different picture than we see today. John Dale also maintained a woodlot and harvested lumber each winter. So again, the transfer of property it became a little confusing with it. 1913, John Dale's daughter had passed away, as had his granddaughter Elizabeth Trimble, and the kind of the last immediate family standing at the time were 2 son-in-laws, Robert Trimble and William Joseph Patterson, and it's through them, and then continuing on in the next generation through Ada, that the property remains in the extended Dale family right up until 1957. And as I mentioned earlier, John himself, the family was both of English and Irish origins, although technically John and Elizabeth, the elders, did not have children of their own that we found, and adopted Elizabeth, and the family line passes down through Elizabeth. One thing to note from the family, again, we don't know what if there was an existing relationship between the parents and Elizabeth, or what her ancestry was. But John and Elizabeth, the elders, were members of the Church of England, whereas Elizabeth, the adopted daughter, was a member of the Primitive Methodist Church located nearby. So again, we can only guess at kind of what those relationships might have been. And so just an interesting little bit of history left on the corner of Dixie and Dairy Road. The Dale House, again, built in 1856, or around 1856. It is still in use today by the Sikh Gurdwara, and is one of the last visible reminders of the lost village of Mount Charles. So again, Catherine, thank you for the question. And if you're ever driving around and you find other historic houses that you're wondering about and curious about, send the questions on in. Love exploring the built history of the city of Mississauga. So thank you. Thank you, Janice, for reaching out, and had connected with the Facebook post on the question of Hand's fireworks, and delighted to receive a question on it. Yes, you remember correctly. The fireworks company that was on Cawthra Road was known as T.W. Hand's Fireworks Limited, and they had an 8-acre site on the west side of Cawthra Road, north of a little bit north of Dundas Street. The property was acquired by Thomas Hand in 1930. Hand's Fireworks, it was an older company. It actually began back in 1873, first in Thorold and then in Hamilton, under Thomas's father, William Hand. Hand Fireworks was the sole supplier of fireworks to the Canadian National Exhibition and to the federal government for a number of years, and the company built on that relationship and that success to become one of the largest firework distributors in North America. T.W. Hand's Fireworks, after 1930, maintained their head office on Cawthra Road, just north of Dundas. Their mailing address was Cooksville. And they remained there from 1930 until 1972. So we're not dealing with, ancient history here. Right up until the early 1970s, Hand's Fireworks was still something that was present here in the city of Mississauga. There is a museum to Hans Fireworks in Prescott, Ontario, and just a kind of fascinating early history that you think of, this thing that is bigger than Mississauga in terms of its reach, but was located here on a quiet rural road at the time, Cawthra Road, between 1930 and 1972. During the Second World War, T.W. Hans Fireworks Limited entered into wartime production of munitions and supplies, namely in the manufacture of explosive shells and parachutes, which honestly seems like a bit of an odd combination. Our understanding is that the factories in Hamilton and here in Mississauga, or what is Mississauga today, were predominantly used for the explosives productions, while another factory in Toronto was focused on the manufacture of parachutes. There were two significant accidents, and I know this was kind of the basis for the conversation that was asked on Facebook, but there are two significant accidents in the factory on Cawthra Road here in Mississauga. The first one on January 31st of 1942 when the powder room exploded. And again, this is during munitions manufacturing during the Second World War. And one employee by the name of Jack Dickinson was killed and several were injured. Windows in nearby houses were blown out by the force of the explosion, and large portions of the factory were burned in the process and had to be rebuilt the following year. Another accident, about a year and a half later, was a fire that broke out on July 6th of 1943 in the mixing plant. And this claimed the life of a young 18-year-old worker, Norma Krantz, injured several others as well. So two accidents, two casualties, both Mississauga residents, Jack Dickinson in 1942 and Norma Krantz in 1943. During the war years, the plant was guarded, and many of the employees lived in temporary housing on the company grounds or nearby. There is no physical evidence of the company on Cawthra Road today. There's nothing that remains to remind us that we're aware of to remind us of T.W. Hans Fireworks Limited. Thomas Hand's son, Hugh Hand, took over the operation of the company in 1945. He added another 24 acres along Cawthra Road, not only for expansion of the factory site, but also for storage. And all of this combined property, the 8 acres that have been acquired in 1930 and the 24 acres in 1945, they were sold for development in 1964, and then finally in 1972 the main factory operations moved to Milton, Ontario. And so long history here in Mississauga, a fascinating one, and unfortunately one that claimed the lives of two of our early residents. But a fascinating way to look at the kind of the story of our city and its development evolution, if you will. Thinking of a very large fireworks manufacturer right in the heart of our city. Something we don't see today in what is largely a residential area today on Cawthra Road. But again, thank you for the question. Keep poking around our early history and walking down memory lane, and let's see what other little interesting tidbits of history we can uncover. Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for the question on, or the inquiry you have on Charlotte Schreiber and finding the plaque on Principals Road at UTM. Yes, indeed, the Ontario Heritage plaque has been there for some time, a little bit out of the way. A lot of kind of wandering public don't make their way onto the grounds of the University of Toronto, Mississauga. But indeed, there is a plaque here that commemorates the famed Charlotte Schreiber, the Canadian artist, and the first woman elected to the Royal Canadian Academy of Artists. Charlotte herself, you're just looking for, you're interested in background information, and there's a lot out there on her, a lot of biography. She's a very famous artist, a lot of biomaterial is available, a lot of studies have been done on her work as well, but fascinating nonetheless, just an interesting early resident in our community. And she was here for a very, very short period of time and left a really strong mark behind her. Charlotte Schreiber was born on May 21st of 1834 in Woodham, Essex, England. Her maiden name was Charlotte Mountbrock Morel. Her father was a minister in the community. Her mother was Mary Mountbrock Morel. Her father was a lover of art and believed in education, and he encouraged his daughter's early artistic talents. Charlotte took anatomy and animal studies in England under the private tutelage of John Rogers Herbert, who was a famous painter of portraits and sacred and historical subjects. Charlotte became a master in the detail of the human form and began exhibiting her work at the Royal Academy in London in 1855. And not great with math, but that was at only 21 years of age, and at the time was the youngest woman painter to be exhibited there. Already the beginnings of an inspiring career for a young artist. Her work was influenced by what was known as the Pre-Raphaelites group of artists, and by 14th century frescoes. So she had a kind of a broad education in the arts. Although Charlotte painted mainly religious subjects, her paintings also included literary and historical subjects as well as landscapes. Prior to painting, she would commence in line drawings, sketches, if you will, and quite often her work focused on portraits of people. She seldom used a frontal pose or direct eye contact. Rather, she used three-quarter poses and profiles. But again, she was a master of painting the human form and was recognized as such. As her medium, Charlotte used mostly oil paints, and occasionally watercolors. She was also a respected graphic illustrator. And so just, a really well-rounded and well-known young artist at that point. On September 28th of 1875, she married her second cousin, Weymouth George Schreiber, himself from the Isle of Guernsey, and they moved together to Toronto with his 3 teenage children. He had been previously married and his wife had passed away. Charlotte herself never had children of her own. Weymouth George Schreiber and Charlotte lived outside of Toronto in a place that Charlotte called Deer Park. And while living in Toronto in her new adopted community here in Canada, she became involved in the arts community in 1876. Very shortly, within a year of being married and coming to Canada, she was elected a member of the Ontario Society of Artists. And in 1877, a year after that, Charlotte Schreiber was appointed to be the only woman on the council of the Ontario School of Art and Design, known today as the Ontario College of Art. In 1880, she was chosen to become a member of the Royal Canadian Academy, and she was the only woman at the time to receive this honor. No other woman would become a member until 1933. Again, just incredible. She is selected in 1880 and not followed up by another woman until 1933. She was also a member of the Women's Art Association of Canada, which she helped to found in 1890. So just an incredibly, not only talented artist, but just someone who is very much involved and a strong contributor to the arts, culture, and community here in Canada. She was a teacher. She taught at the Ontario School of Art and Design, and many students that she inspired, but 2 of the most significant include George Reed and Ernest Thompson Seton, became renowned artists and creators in their own right. Schreiber also delved into landscapes during her later career, and some of these paintings included famed painting Springfield on the Credit, which was painted inspired here from the Erindale area of Mississauga. Her most famous piece of work is likely the one referred to as the Croppy Boy, The Confession of an Irish Patriot. This painting was completed in 1879, based on an Irish revolutionary ballad, and is again one of her most famous paintings. Her husband, Weymouth, acquired a property here in historic Mississauga, and together with his 2 sons, built 3 homes on what is now the Erindale in the Erindale area on the University of Toronto Mississauga campus property. The homes were given grand names: Mount Woodham, which is where Charlotte and her husband Weymouth lived, Iverholme, and Lylehurst. Lylehurst is the only surviving building of the 3, and is now the residence of the principal of the University of Toronto Mississauga. Mount Woodham, the house that Charlotte lived in, included a studio where she painted her work and tutored gifted students. In 1898, she's the one who is attributed with suggesting the that Springfield on the Credit changed its name to Erindale. And so again, just ways in which names are selected. Erindale after the early Reverend's home. Charlotte herself was a proud member of St. Peter's Anglican Church, and Reverend James McGraw, the founder of that church, although he had passed away at that point, his home was called Erindale, meaning Ireland in the valley, and it's attributed to Schreiber that name suggestion was made. She and her husband Weymouth, being wealthier members in the community, helped with the reconstruction of St. Peter's Anglican Church in 1886. Charlotte helped to raise money for the project by selling her artwork, but a specific artwork that was painted of pictures of the original church on the property, and these were put up for sale with the money going towards the building of the new church. She also, if you visit St. Peter's Anglican Church today, she is also credited with hand painting the Nicene Creed, which appears near the altar at St. Peter's Church. So you can go visit her work today within the church, and there's one of her pictures of the original church is also on display in the current St. Peter's Anglican Church. On July 5th of 1898, Weymouth George Schreiber, Charlotte's husband, passed away, and he is buried at St. Peter's Anglican Cemetery here in Erindale. Charlotte, after his death, returned to England, and she lived until July 3rd of 1922, and she passed away in Bath, England. After her death, her great grandson Howard Schreiber gathered all of Charlotte's paintings that could be found at the time, and had an exhibition on the official opening of Erindale College, what is now the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Most of Charlotte's work is held in private collections, but also at the National Gallery of Canada. And just a remarkable individual. In every way, Charlotte was a remarkable woman, an artist, a leading member of her community, and a prominent citizen who is recognized nationally for her contributions to the development of arts in Canada. And she lived for a time right here in what is the city of Mississauga.